Hi, Louise.
Hi, Sarah.
Here we are with, I'm just going to hold up the book for our YouTube watchers. This is American Baby, Gabrielle Glaser. I just mentioned it a couple seconds ago, but to reiterate, we are discussing chapter 11, Childless Mother, which is a
Yes,
very sad title
very
for a very
sad.
sad chapter in a very sad book
Oh,
and a
my
very
goodness.
sad era.
Oh, speaking
Go
of
on.
happier things, if you want to become a Patreon, make sure to sign up because we've had some of our Patreons voting on our next book that we're going to read in season 5. So if you want to say in what we're reading, become a Patreon, give us your vote. We're up to 2 books, I think we're looking at heavily. So let us
Yes,
know.
and current Patreons, some of you have already, but for those who have
Mhm.
yet to weigh in on what book you'd like to see read. And even if it's not in chapter 5, it like depends on the tally. It will be
Yes.
in another I mean, I'm sorry, season 5, and it'll be in another season.
There'll be
So yeah,
another.
just
Yep.
hop onto our Patreon, make your vote,
Love
make
it.
your voice heard,
I like
join.
it. I like that it's a group effort.
Yes, me too. Okay, so now.
So, childless mother. Well, Margaret and George, what upset me the most about this are 2 characters, the 2 people we're talking about, Margaret and George, figured out they get married and cannot have their child. That's just, I
Right.
mean,
Then they had to go to South Carolina,
mm-hmm.
which George, at one point, this is totally aside from what
Yeah.
the book is about, but at one point, George saw someone struggling with a
Yeah.
pinball machine, and he happened to be an African American guy, and George jumped up to help him. And there was a sheriff in the diner who was like, "We don't mix in these parts. You must be
Yeah.
a Yankee, like." So not we're of course we all know it was a very racist era.
Mm-hmm. They
Um,
actually got away to get married by saying they were going to DC.
mhm.
Because that was kind of okay for young people to go to DC and see what's going on there. And the Kennedys were in the White House. And so that's how they got away to elope. And then they came back and convinced their families that they would be married. I mean, in a
Well,
Jewish ceremony.
it took a bit. They remember they
Mm-hmm.
hid it from their families for quite some time. So they even though they were married, they lived apart
Mm-hmm.
for a bit, and then they did finally do their um wedding in the synagogue. And I thought it was, and then Margaret went into how she went to get birth control so that they could be very mindful about when they had
Yeah.
children so that it didn't look like they got pregnant again just to have a shotgun wedding. She was very, very, very
Yeah.
mindful, like they were very much in love. They wanted children, they wanted the
Yeah.
child that they'd had. It was
And then
just
they go
breaking.
back to Dr. Gunderson, who of course treats her so wonderfully this time.
Now that she's got a ring on her finger.
She's got a ring and everybody's not thinking about what's happened. And when she got married, of course, they asked, have you had sex? No. And the what's if you read this book, what's haunting are the pictures, because you
Mhm.
touched on it before about their little dog Taffy he had given her.
Oh, and
Yeah,
Taffy died
yeah,
after 3 weeks, I think, which
yeah,
just devastated Martha. I really cried actually in this
yeah,
episode. Just I related to losing the dog, and I
yeah,
had, I've always had beagle mixes, and
yeah. I thought of
um,
Pearl.
yeah, and Woody.
Oh, Winnie.
And my dog Buffy when I was little. Yeah, so she really went through a lot of
Hmm.
grief and wanted another dog, and then George said, "Well, we're going to have children soon." And so,
And
and then they did. They
then they
got
did.
pregnant.
She
They
gets pregnant, and the sad thing you and I talked about right before we hopped on here is what happens when you give birth back then. What's there was a she
Oh,
they're about to have their baby girl. She's delivering pretty early too, by the way. Didn't it seem like that was like, wasn't she early, like 7.5 months or something? Maybe I'm wrong. I was reading
I don't, that didn't jump out at me.
it then. Okay. Yeah. But anyway, she went in to have her baby, and this time the nurses were nice to her, but this was the era in which women, what was the quote?
Right here it says, um, while by 1960, nearly all American women gave birth to their babies in hospitals. And while that development had significantly reduced both maternal and infant mortality, it also introduced a host of interventions. Some referred to the practices as knock them out, drag them out.
That's it.
Yeah. It didn't have anything to do with the well-being of mothers or babies. It was just,
No.
I mean, and horrific practices like.
And then they gave them, because you were so knocked
the drugs
out,
were so sedating, right, that they couldn't even feel themselves. They couldn't push.
they couldn't push.
At
And then
which
they did
point, then
those
they forceps.
forceps, and they did those horrible episiotomies without necessary.
Right.
And then at the end would stitch them up for a husband's something. There was
a husband's stitch to return the vagina to its pre-childbirth tightness. Because, everything was always about what the man needed and wanted.
A husband's stitch. I'm like, well, how about if we didn't knock out these women and they could just deliver their babies? Wouldn't that be amazing? But Margaret does. Margaret did not get knocked out. She stayed awake and hyper vigilant over that baby the 5 days in the hospital. Lisa Jane.
Yes. And which was another fight with George's father about wanting to name it after their grandmother, named Olga, but Margaret got her way. I love Margaret. She's just such
too.
Just no. And, I really was thinking about when she was, after she had Lisa, and was also in those days, like they didn't encourage you to walk, just like lay in bed,
Yeah. Right.
But that it reminded me of when I had Becker and I made, I put him in bed with me. I was terrified to lose him, that he might get stolen. And
I wouldn't let them.
Yeah.
I did the whole panic thing when they would, they used to want to take him down the hall to do the tests. And I finally told Alberto, my ex-husband, that's his name, come bring them in here, make them. He was like, oh my God. Okay. They'd have to bring this whole traveling car thing. They looked at me like, nothing's going to happen. We're at Cedars-Sinai. And well,
things happen.
Things happen. I didn't believe it. I just had this the whole feeling. I also thought about my adopted mom lost a baby and just how cold they were to women in the hospitals. And it was around this time. It was 1966 when that happened to her. And I was thinking how she must have been treated, because I did know a little bit about that story from her. And that's why people didn't deal with their grief either with some things. It was just like,
move on.
Went in on her own, went home. No one really knew what to say. Everyone felt really bad.
Just move on.
Move on.
And then, after she had Lisa, and, she still thought of Stephen and was still in grief about it. And she didn't want to share that with George because she didn't want him to worry. And so she carried that grief all on her own. And then it talked about, and they tracked those phone calls in the day. So she would go to a payphone and call the Louise Wise agency. And, this is Margaret. I had my baby on this date. And the answer was always the same. Don't call here. A receptionist would tell her.
Every time.
And then what really, I don't mean to dominate the conversation, but it's just, I highlight these things.
Yes.
What one of the things that is just so incredible about these stories that we've witnessed, I went through it, living across the street from my birth mother without knowing it, is that here Margaret was taking Lisa, the baby, to this park, and she still would look around at these little brown-haired boys, wondering if any of them were Stephen. And lo and behold, Esther Rosenberg, the adoptive mother of Stephen / David, would take him to that park, and Margaret would walk past their building
every day. And he was adopted literally like 14 days after their marriage was final. They had the parallel thing going on. So there's this half sister and his mom in the playground.
Also, the Rosenbergs, went through their own tragedies.
Yeah.
But it just highlighted for me again that their infertility and their, all their grief was now placed onto this new child, that just he now carries that burden
Yeah.
of fulfill for them to, love it away or what have you.
Yeah. I'm curious, I don't want to blow through the book, so it's hard not to read ahead,
I
isn't it?
know.
And
Very
so
hard.
we started off with David at the beginning. I mean, David's his name, right? Not
Yes, David's
Stephen.
his adopted name. Yeah.
And I'm curious where it's going to come back to him, how the
Mhm.
circle is going to go. But I'm like, don't read ahead.
Yep. Yep.
Don't read ahead either. Just follow along with us and read together. And make sure to comment, on our Facebook page. We've been getting more traffic. It's exciting having more participation.
Yes. We love the participation, the back and
We
forth.
love it.
And don't forget, weigh in on what you want to, Patreons, weigh in on what book you want for
Yep.
next season. We're getting there. It's not going to be long. It goes fast.
It does go fast. All right. Well, let's stay tuned for our guest.
Okay. See you in a minute.
See you in a minute.